Hello and welcome, everyone. It's great to be in this space with you today. My name is Malis. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm currently actually joining in from Leeds in the UK. You're all kind of trickling in. Welcome, welcome. Please, it'd be great to also hear from you. Where are you joining us from? Tell us your name, your pronouns, your organization, something interesting about you as well, how you're feeling. If I can offer maybe an additional visual description, I am a Black, cisgender, female presenting person. I have Black Afro hair. I'm wearing a pair of patterned glasses. And well, actually in the background, it's just kind of bit of a door, open door, some lighting, and a kitchen and appliances in the background. For those who are new to the space, well, we create space. I'd love to tell you a bit more about us and what we do. We are a community-led platform, a consultancy and a collective of queer change makers, really on this mission to improve the lives of LGBTQ+ people around the world. And we currently support over 100 corporate clients who are at various stages of the DEI journey. So through consultancy, we design shared learning experiences, we produce DEI insights and craft bespoke content that support individuals with strengthening their roles as change agents within their communities and organizations. And as a social enterprise, the profit we make from this work that we do with our partners is invested back into the LGBTQ+ community to provide free events like this one, online, also in-person events. We also offer free resources, leadership development opportunities, and well-being solutions. And we're quite proud to have delivered over 1,000 events and shared experiences and invested over £350,000 back into the LGBTQ+ community. We'd love to do this work and continue to do it for the years to come, and we'd love for you to get involved even more. So there are a couple of things you can do. First, well, you're actually doing it. You're here today, so keep showing up to some of our events, also our in-person events. Please share our social posts, amplify our speakers' voices, their projects, and introduce us to your employers and colleagues if you do feel there's an alignment with some of the topics that we bring, or you see value in us connecting even further beyond this space. It's been an absolute pleasure for myself as a program director within We Create Space to shape these topics. And we're so excited to dive deep into this really powerful and necessary conversation around queer allyship. So exploring LGBTQ+ anti-racism as queer leaders, how we go about confronting bias, and our role in systemic inequities. A big topic, as you can imagine, specifically bringing this forward today. Some of you may be aware that it is the anniversary of George Floyd's death, third year. And there's a lot of conversation, I think, happening even beyond the corporate space as to what change needs to happen, what we need to see to progress this conversation around anti-racism, but not just the conversation. How do we become anti-racist leaders? And merging this with an intersectional perspective, adding the additional layer of the LGBTQ+ experience. I'm so excited to be joined by our panelists today, who will have the opportunity to introduce themselves. Quick framing in terms of how we tend to bring these topics forward. We always encourage our participants to engage with the content in a way that supports their well-being. We will be talking about racism and potentially other challenging experiences. And so we will do our part to share trigger warnings when needed. But we also, our intention essentially is to offer solutions that are, focused on perspectives and actionable steps as well to drive positive change and transformation forward within our communities and workplaces. So I want to ask Yassine to come on screen and take over from here. I really look forward to connecting with you all further. You can use the chat as you're already doing so to introduce yourselves. also to ask questions throughout the session, and the Q&A function is also open for you to direct any questions you may have to our panelist here today. All right, Yaz, over to you. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, thank you, Melis. Thank you for that introduction. Hi, everybody. My name is Yaz, or Yassine, pronouns she and her. I'm actually joining today from beautiful Bali, but it is the middle of the night here. So I am an EDI specialist. My areas of expertise are LGBTQ plus inclusion and building anti-racist spaces. But of course, recognizing that we are not one-dimensional human beings, we are multifaceted. And so we have to do this work through an intersectional lens. And so it's vitally important that we're looking to make those connections as we do our inclusion work, and as we think about how we're building community and moving towards creating change in our cultures and approaches to people. My visual description, I'm a Black woman. I'm dark-skinned. I've got short cropped Afro textured hair. I'm wearing a black and white button-up shirt, and I have a silver chain on, and I'm wearing gold wire-rimmed glasses. My background is kind of low lit white wall, it should be, and you can possibly see a curtain in the corner as I'm in a hotel. And yeah, just to kind of introduce, this is a theme, this topic is incredibly important to me. It obviously impacts my personal life, my experiences. I move through the world and through workplaces. But, as with like these conversations around EDI generally, I think it is really important that we are starting to make these connections between identities that are sometimes seen to maybe be at odds with one another, or where people overlook connections, or you feel like you have to choose one element of yourself in order to, find community and perhaps to be able to navigate through the world. And I think it's also important to recognize that just because you are of a marginalized experience, it is still possible to participate in oppression and these systems that keep some of us in these positions. And we'll dive into that a little bit more as the session goes on. And so, yeah, as I said, all of our panelists and myself will be bringing our own intersectional lens to share practical ways to confront personal and organizational bias to influence inclusion and racial equity for LGBTQ plus people of color in the workplace and beyond. And like any habit, anti-racism requires a conscious decision to pursue it as a goal and a way of being. It has to become part of our actions, our everyday thinking, our everyday approaches. Even as queer leaders and DEI advocates, we often resort to existing within networks that resemble who we are and that we feel comfortable in. How then do we challenge our personal biases and identify where they are supported by institutional power and dominance? When can we get really curious and understand how bias impacts our behavior towards LGBTQ plus people of color? And can we start to facilitate meaningful allyship that eradicates micro-inequities based on presumptions of ignorance? So that's just an introduction to the session. Some of the themes we'll be discussing today, as Melis said, it's a heavy topic. It could get very deep. It could be triggering for some of us. So please do bear that in mind. But on that note, I will ask our panelists to step in and introduce themselves, let us know a bit about you. We are joined by some really incredible people with really great knowledge on these themes. So I'd ask you to share, but perhaps your name, pronouns, your affiliation, and a brief summary of why this topic is important to you. What does it mean to you for us to be in this space having this conversation today? So I will start with the first person I can see, Zav. Would you like to, oh no, sorry, who's that? Yeah, Zav, would you like to go first?
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you, Yassine. Yes, I'm a cisgender gay male. I'm happily married to my husband. I've been happily married to my husband for the past 24 years. So a long-term relationship. I'm a coach. I'm a facilitator. I have to say that I'm not really an expert of this topic, but I love holding this conversation, especially in business, especially around the DEI topic. So I do a lot of facilitation where people hold very antagonistic views around discrimination and what's fair and not fair as practices in businesses. And yet this topic is very important to me for many, many reasons. And one of them being that I think once you overcome some struggles in life, some of us forget what it means to overcome these struggles for different reasons. And it triggers compassion in me automatically. So it triggers a willingness to reach out. Yes, so this is why I'm here. And then I'm going to pass the baton to let's see. Sanjuka, I think you can next.
Hi, everyone. So yes, thanks for that, Xavier. So I'm Sanyukta. I'm South Indian and I'm based in Spain. I use she, her, ella pronouns, but to me, honestly, because the pronouns is very important, but for me, the pronunciation of the name is super important. So that's why I have the thingy there before my pronouns. So I, as a visual description, I am a medium-toned South Indian woman, cisgender woman. I'm queer. I'm wearing a beautiful bottle green dress and sitting at home with plants in my background and some lighting. It should be okay now. And I work as a monitoring and evaluation consultant advising nonprofit organizations. And my work revolves exclusively around decolonized, participatory, inclusive, and intersectional feminist approaches. And as a very out and proud queer woman myself, I run a feminist and anti-racist organization. So this topic is super important to me because my lived experience of having an intersectional feminist identity, I kind of see it from different perspectives and what marginalization and exclusion can look like within different communities. So I'm really looking forward to getting into it with everybody here and to have some very uncomfortable conversations and to sit with individual discomfort because that's my sweet spot. Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to it. So hi, everyone.
Okay, and then we'll move to Andre.
Hi, everyone. Yes, would you be able to turn my video back on? I don't have the rights on this side. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here. As was said, my name's Andre. My pronouns are he and they. And my day job is I work for Westminster City Council here in London as the systems change lead. And I'm also a speaker and consultant. And a little bit about why this topic is important to me today. Oh, actually, my visual description is I'm light brown skinned, I guess, male presenting person, wearing a white and black striped top, sat in front of a nice piece of art on the wall, and in front of a very, very white wall. And a little bit about why this work is important to me in this conversation. As you might be able to tell from my accent, I am from the United States. I grew up in the South in a fundamentalist evangelical home, and grew up with one parent being Black and the other parent being white in a kind of post 9/11 era. So being queer, non-binary, and dual heritage, the intersection of kind of bisexuality and ethnicity and racism, and particularly anti-Black racism, has always been quite a big part of my life, big part of the conversations that have kind of been thrust upon me, kind of existing in between both spaces. And when I first moved to London, I was not out, and I would engage with a lot of different, or try to engage with different queer spaces, but like a lot of people who present as male, found myself kind of kept being like pulled into these queer spaces that actually were spaces kind of designed for and by white cis men, which there's nothing wrong with that. But because of that and my, I guess, inability to connect with that, had a hard time to kind of coming to terms with my own queerness and my own non-whiteness. And so I think, yeah, it's a really important topic that I'm excited to engage in because it's been a journey for me, and I'm sure it has been for everyone here. So excited to chat today.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Really, really excited to have you all here, particularly because you do have different professional backgrounds and professional experience and perspectives that you'll bring to the conversation, but also, of course, really, really excited and interested to hear more about your personal perspectives on some of these themes and how they relate to your identities. So firstly, as queer people, we often think of ourselves as being absolved of guilt when it comes to discrimination. I think that's something that Zav, you touched on, kind of forgetting the journey that we might have been on ourselves and some of the obstacles we might have faced. So how do we begin to process belonging to marginalized groups ourselves, or perhaps LGBTQ+, Black, Indigenous people of color, being a woman, whatever your different identities are. So how do we process belonging to those groups and within these marginalized communities and still being complicit in the oppression of others? And I'll put this to all three of you. Maybe let's start with Sanyukta.
Thanks. Yeah, for me, everything kind of revolves around humility and understanding your own place in the world and knowing that no individual person or community is by default better, more marginalized, less marginalized than another. We're all, I mean, there are some that are definitely less marginalized than others, but like, you know what I mean? Like within this space, like we're all equally effed. So to sit back and have a little bit of humility and recognize that that nobody else is going to see the world in the same way that you do. And I think it's important to also acknowledge the role of power here. So there's a nexus. I think there's like 4 to 5 types of power that was developed in the early 2000s. I can share that later. So it's like power within, power with, power to, and power with. So who it is that your group exerts power over and who exerts power over you, and being very open and honest with that. And, you know, it's, I think, to realize that I mean, also that humanity is not a monolith within like the LGBTQ community globally. I mean, come on, we could not be more varied. And I was mentioning to the rest of the panelists before we joined, I began my queer journey thinking that I was bisexual and facing the biphobia of the community. So we're not even kind to each other, never mind other people who are marginalized. So so it's also just like acknowledging the fact that just because you might face discrimination and systemic oppression doesn't automatically make you morally superior to another person, and that individuals need to acknowledge whom it is that they exert power over and who, where they sit like on the global pecking order hierarchy, and to just take a step back and to be quiet and listen to the people who are oppressed by their in-group. Like, for example, I have class privilege. So in conversations about class, I am like the least qualified person to talk. So I shut up and listen. And that's what we all have to do, is to realize that and shut up and listen, and to be okay with the fact that we are all guilty of being part of a group that does, in, you know, either explicit, inexplicit, violent or not, we all are part of groups that oppress or benefit from systems of oppression over another. Yeah. That's it.
Thank you. Andre?
Thanks, Jess. Yeah, so the way that I kind of approach this, actually, for a bit of context, I would probably describe my career trajectory as someone who's a bit of unfortunately, a bit of a professional do-gooder. I started in the charity space and kind of, you know, you can fill in the blanks. And on top of that, I'm someone who's not very good at admitting when they're wrong or when they're sorry about things, much to my partner's dismay. And so when it comes to this kind of conversation in question, it's quite a difficult one for me to kind of to grapple with, because I think it requires a level of vulnerability. But the way that I kind of address this is maybe I'll just share through a story. So as I mentioned, I grew up in kind of post 9/11 states in very specific context, and in a that was, you know, very Islamophobic. And it wasn't until I was in my 20s and I moved to London that I'd ever even met someone who practiced Islam, let alone had, you know, a relationship or kind of taken time to unpack the internalized Islamophobia that I had. And I realized that I was Islamophobic when I was walking down Regent Street and had this moment with a person, and then reflected on that moment. It was, and they had no idea this moment happened. They just walked by me. And I, reflected on that moment and realized, why did I have this like innate fear inside of me just because of the way that this person was dressed? And it really sat unwell with me, being someone who's a professional do-gooder. And so quite close proximity to that, I met someone who I had to work with, and we developed quite a good friendship. And they were a really great person to kind of provide helpful challenge for me. And so I think in terms of how we can actually address this, the first thing I would say is find someone who can give you a helpful challenge, because it is really hard, and you have to kind of be vulnerable and trusting people to be able to give you that space and question you on things, and be able to ask them questions, knowing that you might say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. And then the second thing is I then started to really position myself in spaces and places that were going to make me uncomfortable. As Sanyukta said, it is something that we have to get better at doing and being. And so, I was like attending iftar events, like on Ramadan, I was like reading the Quran, and just purposely like asking this friend to invite me to things where I would, be the minority in the room, or the only person in the room who wasn't Islamic. And I'm not saying that I'm perfect there, and I've achieved, whatever that end in sight is, but I think for me that was definitely the first steps. And then after I took those steps, the change started to happen, and I started to feel kind of that guilt was no longer a barrier, and I could actually engage in these conversations and these spaces a little bit more meaningfully.
Okay, great. I'll wrap this all up in a second, but Zav, would love to hear from you. Yeah, because I think there's so many interesting points coming through already, and that actually lead into some of the other topics we're going to touch on in the session as well. So yeah, Zav, your thoughts?
Yes, we're going to stay on that panel 6 months, I think. There's so many things. So apologies to Yukta for not saying your name before. And Andre, thank you for what you shared, because it resonates a lot with my own experience. Before I start, I would like to, when I read that question, or when you said the question, I was reminded of an event that happened to me in 2004, I think it was. And so I think it was in the Netherlands, but I'm not completely sure. In 2004, there was a prominent gay man in the media who was also a member of the extreme right party, I think, over there, if I'm not mistaken. And it really puzzled me. I remember reading the news and said, how can you be a member of a community and at the same time, belong to a party who is so anti-LGBT and so conservative and everything? And then a straight friend of mine told me, but you know what, Xavier, this is the boomerang effect. LGBT is mainstream these days. In the Netherlands, it's completely okay. So you can be both LGBT and be part of the extreme right party then, because it's no longer seen as something that's going to discriminate you. So then you are free to belong to any party. And I say, oh, wow, I never thought of that. I never had thought of that. That suddenly that all the activism that happened in the 70s and so on, everything that the community had worked for would suddenly turn its head around in a way. And that is, for example, in France, it's very true. You have many members of the extreme right party who are gay, openly gay, and it's a non-fact. So yeah. So that was actually for me a way to think, how then, what have we learned? What have I learned if I'm a member of this community? Where do I stand with that? Because I'm really a believer of freedom of speech and being able to have any political opinion that you think is, belongs to you, even the worst ones in a way, or extreme ones, because I think all the opinions should be around the table and we should be able to discuss. And at the same time, it's so antinomic to me. So point one, and then to relate to what Andre said, I also come with a very conservative background. My parents were not religious, but they were very conservative. And I'm going to say something that maybe is going to shock some of you here in the audience, but my mom told me when I was 14, she literally told me that sentence: the worst thing that could happen to me would be that you would marry a black girl. I ended up marrying a white man. But literally these words were said. So just to give you like an idea of the racism, that was in my family, like anti-Islam, anti-Black, anti-everything, anti-different, basically. And what happened to me growing up, being an adult, and really having to remove that, in a way, that education for me and stand for my own values, was the following thing, because I think it's quite sneaky. And I think Andre touched upon this, when you saw that guy in the street and say, oh, but I'm not Islamophobic. Why am I'm having this fear reaction? When these messages have been repeated to you for many, many years, what happens to your psyche is that there's a part of you, there's like a voice in you, like a ghost, a gremlin, whatever you want to call it, that still sends these messages to you. So I can be in situations where, for example, I would see people of color in the street or something, and I would have these biases and stereotypes jump into my head, and I have to do, like, literally, I have to catch myself in the act and think, oh, why am I thinking this? This is the message coming from my parents, but this is not me. This is not what I think. I just want to say it requires almost constant, it's like a muscle, and you cannot let go of that muscle. I'm not sure I've answered the question completely, Yassine, but this is where I stand.
No, I think it's a really great answer. It's about that constant reflection and practice. And I think all of you have touched on this, that being self-aware of where your own backgrounds is and where you've had those moments of belong to these dominant power groups where you experience privilege yourself, and how these things influence our thinking, and also especially because of the different sources of that influence, whether it is media or societies or communities around us, whether it's our family, it can be very difficult to unpick that because it may be all we've ever known. It may really kind of form our thinking or subconscious thinking or unconscious thinking. So all really, really important points, particularly that last one about it being this constant muscle you have to develop. So it does require that work, but the more you do it, the more you start to catch yourself. You do start to acknowledge that. And Andre, I really liked you were talking about putting yourself in a position to learn. And this kind of leads into the next question. And with these following questions, I'm going to direct them at certain members of the panel, but please, if anybody has anything they want to add, do dive in at the end as well. But so first, Sanyukta, do you think our community is equipped to engage in uncomfortable dialogue about racial harm and also the movement forward about healing as well? Could you dive into that and explore that for us?
Yeah, I think simple answer, no, we're not. Because our community has to first deal with, and again, I'm making very broad generalizations about a whole community globally of all kinds of difference, but we have to first deal with our internalized self-loathing, and then the phobia that we have within the community. Again, I spoke about biphobia, but I really think that's very, very messed up in a community that claims to be accepting of different sexualities, that I get told by people from within the community, pick a side, which is what straight people are supposed to tell me, not my own people. So I think that definitely not. But I wanted to pick up on something that both Alex and Zav mentioned, and I think it's a very important topic about internalized biases and marginalizations and phobias, is that it's not this kind of gremlin-y, demonic thing that sometimes, your own biases and phobias, and they're these small whispers. And because the two of you have been vulnerable with yours, I'll be clear with mine. I began my life as like an activist. I did a lot of work doing pro-Palestine work. And I didn't realize until I went to college and I was confronted with, these things about, oh, if you're pro-Palestine, that automatically makes you anti-Semitic, to actually have to confront, am I? Like, does my hatred of the Israeli government translate to anything resembling, anything about the Israeli people or Jewish people? And it's this really difficult things that you have to sift through. And I did, and I recommend them, even though methodologically a little flawed, because I have to pick apart methodology, that's what I do, is the implicit association test or something. I think it's called IAT with Harvard. You can choose different kinds of categories and do it and figure out your own like bad stereotypes and biases and things. And I'm also, the reason I'm stopping is that I'm trying to stop myself from saying the word blind spot, because that's an ableist term, because it is a blind spot, but that's, that's not, it's not an inclusive way to talk. So that's what I'm working on right now. So I think we each need to understand, like, that before and also that we need to understand that the different movements around the globe look differently, and that progress towards LGBT rights and trans rights and doesn't all look like San Francisco, and then we need to respect global movements. And I think as an Indian, I see a lot of that. I see a lot of people assuming automatically that our queer movement is like backwards and that we don't have any rights. And like the recent overturning of the homosexuality law in India was like, oh my God, that's brilliant. It's a landmark. Actually, that law was introduced by the British colonizers. We were super progressive before we were colonized. We're good, thank you. And so to recognize that progressive movements can exist and do exist outside the Western space, but that's, we can talk about that later. But I think we have a lot to reckon with in terms of the racialized bias that's very common throughout our community. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a really great answer. Particularly, I mean, and it's like we've all been saying, it just revolves or requires that starting point of that deep self-reflection and not shying away from it. Because I think, it can be difficult, it can be uncomfortable. Andre, you mentioned being that professional do-gooder. Sanukta, you're talking about, your work in the kind of for progress, in support of other marginalized people, yet still having to obviously do that unpacking yourself to make sure that you can do that work. Without or trying to actively remove some of that bias that may be informing it, and you might not even be conscious of that. And so also you mentioned and talked about decentering there as well, which I think is really a pivotal element of the conversation, and whether that is our individual decentering of our own experiences and kind of recognizing, as we said, about, our biases and our power and our privilege. But also, I think, and this may apply, and we'll dive into this a bit more later, on an organizational sense, that kind of global decentering. So we absolutely do, I think, have a tendency in the Western space to prioritize or think that we are so far ahead. But in part of that unpacking, you've gone in there about, going back to how things were pre-colonization, this position, the point in time where actually a lot of the inequality that we see today was embedded into our societies. And I think that's really, if we're going to be doing that personal unpacking, we do have to do that on a wider global reflective level as well. Kind of moving away from this a little bit, but also obviously a vital part of this conversation, we do need to reflect on the notion of colorism and how this influences, even within POC communities across different cultures, but definitely shows up quite a lot in the Black community. But Andre, would you like to tell us about that as a person of mixed heritage or dual heritage, who's had perhaps a wide range of experiences with that in the southern states of America, and then as you moved across the world as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think, and as you kind of alluded to, as I just want to kind of preface that this is kind of my take on it, and that take is going to be also influenced by my experience, by the complexion of my skin, which, as I mentioned before, is light brown. But what I find really interesting about colorism and is that I think the way that I kind of understand it is colorism is highly contextual, and what I mean by that is that I wasn't really fully aware of colorism until I moved to the UK, and I don't think that there's probably like a number of different factors that are involved, but it's just more to highlight my experience of being dual heritage in the States, growing up in the South, where I think because of slave trade and history of colonialism in the Americas, there is, what is kind of deemed as Blackness, or the way that people socialize Blackness, is just different than the UK. And so, and if you really kind of broke it down, a lot of people who would fall into the Black category in the States are probably ethnically, a mix of a number of different things. And when I came to the UK, where a good percentage of the population is kind of, I guess, directly from Africa or places where I guess the perception of Blackness is just different. And so say all of that just to say that colorism is really interesting and challenging to address, because ultimately it's about recognizing that although you might be able to relate to some of the experiences or all of the, although you might be identified as part of a community, you may not have all of the challenges that community faces. Growing up, I grew up in a Black neighborhood. There was no question of my Blackness, and that wasn't part of a conversation. But when I moved to the UK, I realized that the way that a lot of people socialized me here was not always based on my Blackness, and often their proximity to Blackness was affected the way that they socialized me, whether they were, and I'm not going to draw on any generalizations there, but I thought that was really interesting and my understanding of it, because what it really forced me to do is to look inside and to really begin to train that muscle that Zav was speaking about. Because when these conversations and topics would want to come up, oftentimes I would be able to relate to an experience, or I would be able to, identify with something that was being said, but also realized really just through making those mistakes that there were times where I was actually kind of recentering myself in that conversation. And by doing so, actually making other people who, might experience, and specifically anti-Black racism, much more, regularly in their daily lives, or they might have different experiences to it. That recentering of myself actually was kind of dampening and I guess impacting their experience of those conversations. And the way that I've come to understand it now, and this is through a journey, right? I've like studied in this space, I work in this space, and it's taken me 30 something years to get to this point where I've now come to a place where I realize that I guess the mantle that I hold, being someone who is fair-skinned but also Black, is that I do have a role to stand in the gap and to kind of to use that. And it's unfortunate, and it's not to say, and I have to be very careful about when I do that, because it's not about doing that on behalf of someone or in a way that makes them, is kind of taking up space that they might want to occupy, but it's about recognizing that I'm at a place in my kind of self-understanding in my life where I do have the kind of, I guess, reserves. I want to be careful about the word I'm using here, but the reserves to draw from to have these conversations, and unfortunately, sometimes in these spaces, it is my experience of whiteness that enables me to have those conversations with white people to help them to understand the realities and the nuances of racism. And unfortunately, sometimes in those spaces, it is that the whiteness in me that legitimizes that. And now I don't fundamentally agree with that, and I think that's wrong and recapitulates the system. And I have to be very careful when I tread those lines. But that's kind of how I understand colorism. But as Sanyukta said, like, it's something that I'm working on. And even as I'm going through this now, I'm like, oh, actually, I'll probably say that differently next time, and this and that, because and it's something that you kind of always have to be developing and growing. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, some really interesting stuff raised there. And there was a point particularly about, obviously, we keep coming back to it, of that reflection of your positionality even within belonging to a marginalized group, and that being part of your heritage, but recognizing that you may not have the same experiences as other members of that group. And ultimately, we will all have different experiences, actually. But you were saying something about kind of using yourself as that bridge, and using the facts of how you understand yourself and your experience within belongs to some of those groups, and also perhaps how people might perceive you, and actually looking for opportunities to use that as to your benefit in terms of creating these conversations. So Zav, I was wondering if you could touch on this next question around starting or boarding onto your change journey to become anti-racist. You mentioned earlier, and thank you for being vulnerable about this, but that the statement that your mother made and kind of unpacking what you were told by your family. So how did you start your journey? What did you have to balance? What challenges and opportunities did you encounter in it as well?
Well, yeah. So when, you know, I really consider identity as in whatever means we define it, as a sanctuary for each of us on this earth, you know, every human being. So when I had to really become assertive about my own identity and my sexual orientation, it became very clear to me, which wasn't quite late, I was 21. It became very clear that my view of the world would change. And whatever I was given as an education, I had to go down the drain. And I really felt within me that I was actually a green field, that I could define my identity, my values, you know, the way I would see the world under my own terms, in my own terms. And of course, it came with a lot of challenges and hurdles and mistakes and stuff. But that was really, at least I held that intention, and I still hold that intention to this day. And that's something I train people on, by the way. Maybe I want to draw the bridge with something else that happened. So 1 year ago, in my facilitation / coaching, you know, environment, I received an assignment from a UK-based company to start holding DEI conversations in a prominent company in Switzerland. And I thought, well, I think I'm going to take the assignment, but I think I'm the least qualified person to do this. And I thought, because exactly like a bit like Andre said, this space, I mean, I love the fact that this company here, this is called We Create Spaces, because for me, that space of conversation, I'm so afraid of offending anyone all the time and becoming less and less afraid, maybe, that I always come to these conversations very guilty, you know, full of guilt, full of, am I going to say the wrong thing? And am I going to have one person leaving the room because I said the wrong thing about the gender, or about the ethnicity, or about, you know, using a word that to me means nothing, but to them means something very rude, you know? And I said, well, anyway, I'm going to take the assignment. I'm going to try. I'm going to give it a try. Almost, thank God I'm gay. I'm part of a minority almost, you know, thinking, thank God, you know. And wow, I loved every single bit of this conversation. And I felt so privileged for being able to hold them. And there was a lot of different things we talk about, but the very first question that was asked to the participants were a bit the question you asked at the beginning, I think, which was, how do you identify as a person of color? And there was this lady from India who was the first one to talk. She was on my left. She was the first one to talk, and we were a small group of 5 people, so quite a small group. And she said, you know what? I resent that question. I really dislike this question. When I was in India, that was never in my reference, you know. I was just a person. And since I moved to Europe, I'm feeling forced to identify as a person of color. And she looks at me and said, you are a person of color too. You are a person of color white. And I'm a person of color brown. And that should be okay with everyone. Why? But why? Why do I have to define ourselves this way? So, and that triggered so I had a whole script for my training. And that whole script at that moment got derailed because we spent 45 minutes just on that, which I thought was exactly the space we needed to create. And, you know, before Sanyukta, you said, you know, shut up and listen. And I'm going to twist what you said by 90 degrees to say, I would love to be able to say, speak up and listen, and please help me recover. Let's have a conversation so we can both recover when something we said and something, you know, we did is not landing on your end in the way I meant it. But let's train each other and let's respect each other. You know, I would love for everybody to be able to speak. I think Yassine and Andre and Sanyukta, I think a lot of people are just afraid of saying the wrong things. And maybe I'm generalizing. Maybe I am. But I would love for these conversations to feel very spacious for everyone. That's how I do it.
I do love that point about, opening the space. That's what it's about, to hear from each other's experiences. That has to be the starting point. And of course, challenging that discomfort, because you should feel uncomfortable around some of these things, you know, it is, and it can be scary, and you will get things wrong. It's really important to remember that, but that of course is how you learn. Like if you had all the answers, you wouldn't have a problem, you know, or the inequity and injustice that we face. I'm really conscious of time, so if you have questions, please do start or continue putting them into the Q&A, the question box, and I really want to be able to get to at least a few of them. So I'm going to push ahead to a couple final questions, basically, that I'm going to open up to the panel, if anybody who has any thoughts on them. But you know, we talk a lot, or some of the conversation is starting to move towards this conversation around solidarity over allyship. And we're starting to see that used more and more. And in my terms, how I kind of understand that is that solidarity is really thinking about, as we keep saying, our own experience, how that kind of has shaped how we treat other people, our perceptions of other people, our biases, etc. Recognizing our power and privilege, and kind of that decentering piece is essential to that as well. So like you're saying, not seeing yourself as, you know, I'm white, so I'm the center. Whereas somebody, you know, everyone else is othered, or everyone else is, I think Xavier previously used the term anti-different, but for me that immediately spikes something where it's like, you say anti-different because you kind of see yourself as the center, not your kind of parents or whoever was telling you that information. But I found that very interesting as a statement. And whereas allyship does still seem to occasionally have this association perhaps of a savior complex, or you know, kind of I'm kind of stepping in and supporting, you know, kind of poor marginalized people, and I'm doing something so great, and kind of, you know, so that's not necessarily how it is or what it has to be. But I think, you know, sometimes that can be, well, I want to hear your opinions on this actually as well. Just what do we think there's a difference? Do we think that's what we should be moving towards, this concept of solidarity over allyship? What is the difference between those two practices in your opinions? I'm gonna, Sanukta, do you happen to have an answer available for this? Because I think it'd be really interesting to hear your perspective.
I have part of an answer, I think. So to me, I kind of see it as like my instinctive thing when I read those two words is that it's like the difference between at least how Ibrahim Kendi defines being not racist and being an anti-racist, is that it's like, so the way he defines it is that people say you're either racist or you're like, I'm not racist, or you're an anti-racist. And for him, the difference between the two is you might not have racist thoughts, but if you don't speak up when people say racist things, or you don't fight, then you're not an anti-racist. If you fight and you stand up and you do something, then that makes you an anti-racist, or you're like on the path. And so that is, I think, the difference to me between solidarity, because that's like collectivism. That's like easily resharing stuff on social media, doing, you know, the blackout post on Instagram when Black people are murdered by the police, but then when you have conversations with your friends and family, not speaking up, not saying anything, and not being brave. It's a lot to ask because, like Andre, I work in this sector. So like this complex of saviorism and do-gooderism, we call ourselves the charity sector, for goodness sake, at least in the UK. It's nonsense. The kind of the complex that it gives us about, oh, we're saving the world. It's so it is something to be mindful of. So you can't expect everyone to kind of take up the mantle and be an activist, but it's like that. It's, you're an ally when you show up to like Pride, or you take on things and you are contributing to causes, or you're signing petitions, and you're in solidarity if you like repost something, or you share like RIP when George Floyd is murdered, stuff like that. That's super easy, that takes no effort, and that is performative. That's kind of how I see it a little bit.
Interesting. Yeah, and I kind of, you mentioned earlier something about us all being equally effed, and I quite like that. I think it's quite interesting. Well, for me, when I think of solidarity, that's kind of it. We're like, we all are being kind of crushed by these systems, and they're not designed to benefit any of us, really. So it's kind of recognizing that even if you may have certain or be afforded certain privileges because of them, ultimately we're all like in this together, right? Zav, do you have any quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I'm also reading what Jesse has written on the chat, which I think is very important. I'm thinking, is this what I'm doing? To be fair, again, a space that I'm in before this conversation is compassion. how do I want to say? What do I want to say? It's just an assumption that I have, that because many people don't know how to navigate these conversations, they're trying to do something or to be something that seems to them be in the right direction. I'm going to put a lot of quotes here, the right direction, not paying attention to the impact it creates, and not paying attention maybe to the way it can be perceived when you are completely educated on the topic, or more educated on the topic. And again, I think the words are not perfect in the way I phrase them. So, for example, the example of posting something on Instagram, maybe in the bottom of my heart, I'm trying to be genuine. It's not manipulative, and I'm trying to say, oh, look, you know, I'm supporting the cause and so forth. But then you say, yeah, but then where's your courage? Now, where you're pointing to Anita, it's actually courage. Where's your courage? What I want to say is that courage and vulnerability, as you all know, they get along together. They are the two faces of the same coin. And that's what's missing in most of these conversations we have around these topics. If you want people to have courage, you have to accept also your own vulnerability, and you have to accept them being vulnerable and being able to make these mistakes, and not to yell at them when they do. Sometimes these positions are so hard on both sides of this equation that because there's no discussion possible, then there's no way for people to learn, and they stick to what they know, or even they get away from it. Yes, I think that's what I can say that is reflective about the topic where I am right now in my life.
Thank you. And thank you for being kind of vulnerable from your own journey as well within this, and that point of us all being on this journey and it being an ongoing practice. I think that's been mentioned in the chat. And I really appreciate the perspectives that are being put forward in the chat as well. I think that's really important. Of course, we're here to learn from each other. So the final question that I'll be asking, and I think it's really important that we do get to this, because I imagine it's kind of what brought a lot of us to this space as well, is because we're talking about this from an organizational perspective. So when it comes to operationalizing anti-racism within our organizations, how can we leverage the power of employee resource groups, role models, policies, etc., to progress equality, and also acknowledging that people have different understanding, different experiences, different perspectives. So how are we bringing people together to be able to have these conversations and push forward together? I'll start with Andre, and yeah, just really mindful of time. And if there are any questions, please do put them in the chat now as well. And maybe we'll have a minute or two to get to them. But Andre, would you like to go first?
Sure. So just, yeah, I think, I kind of wrote out some thoughts, and I think this could actually applies individual level and on organizational level, but something that we've had to go and do, and kind of the process that we've taken is, I think first and foremost, you know, if you're in the leadership capacity, or if I, you know, my kind of, this is my words to leadership, is to first do the work yourself. Because if you go and try to engage in these conversations and you haven't done the work, it will show, and it will show really fast, and shut down and close doors and shut down conversations. And I recognize that there's probably a range of different sizes of organizations and you know, represented in the room, and not everyone might have people from every community or every identity or intersection that they're trying to work with or support represented in their organization. If they're not in your organization, you need to find people who can stand in the gap for those people on their behalf. And so if you do the work and you find the people, then and only then are you probably ready to start thinking about solutions. And I would say when it comes to solutions, they should be co-designed with the communities that you're trying to support, because the only way that you can kind of effectively do the next step is through kind of building solutions with people as equal partners. And once you've done that, thinking about maybe how you release power and resource, because if you're not going to kind of take, you know, organizations talk a lot about being anti-racist, but if they're not putting time and money behind it, it's not going to happen. And that's something that we've had to do. And, you know, we've last year we kind of installed this, where people who are doing the work internally in the organization, they have signed commitments from their line managers committing a percentage of their resource to that. So that's built into their contracts. And not just to do the work, also the time that they need to recover from doing the work, because this is hard work. You're talking about people bringing their trauma and platforming their trauma for work. And so, once you've kind of released the power and some resource, then you can go back to square one and start the process all over again, because it's a continued process.
Yep, some really good stuff there, but particularly around recognizing the mechanisms to make sure that it is sustainable, that you can keep going back, that you can keep building on what you've done, and that you're really recognizing the human cost of it as well. And similarly, someone's put in the chat around it being lonely work. And so it is like finding those opportunities for to support people in being able to do this work, and to support how much it takes to do it as well. Okay, and yeah, we're kind of coming to the end of the session, but I really just want to say thank you to our panelists for your insights, your very varied perspectives on these things, and being really open and vulnerable with your personal experiences as well. Yeah, I'm going to hand over to panelists now, just because I'm conscious that we're going to try and wrap the session, and there didn't seem to be any questions. But as always, please do send them through if anything does come to mind, because with these sessions, I think there's always opportunity for us to continue deepening the conversation. So yeah, Melissa, I'll pass over to you, but thank you everybody for joining today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Yes, Zav, Sanyukta, Andre. I mean, there was some key takeaways that we'd love to share with you, because we recorded them on Mentimeter. But again, I want to thank you all for all those who participated and shared. I think when we have these conversations, I think in our own bodies, I don't know about you all, but there seems to be that tension that rises, because we're all conscious that at any point, we're all on this learning journey of unpacking and unlearning, and the pieces around guilt, the emotions that emerge, but also the vulnerability, I think binds us. And this is where it gets quite interesting to be able to start doing this work. So we'd love to hear more about your thoughts, your experiences. We have a survey that we'd love to share in the chat. So please give us a bit more feedback as well as to what you'd love to hear more about. This is a conversation we will keep revisiting, because that's part of our work, not only, but we love to bring to our community to start unpacking. And we really love your support in driving this conversation forward. And again, hearing other perspectives as well from a global perspective. So thank you all for being part of this conversation and really showing up and being vulnerable as well in your own journeys. And yeah, I'm learning as much as everybody else. Yeah, I think it's a real moment to sit and reflect on what we truly need to change within ourselves, but also in the spaces around us, so that we can show up as better allies, intra-community allies as well, for our siblings as well. So that's it from our side. We'll be wrapping up the session today. Thank you to all of you who've showed up for the last kind of 2 months for these panels that we've been having every Thursday. We will probably be sure to bring some back after Pride season, but as you know, yeah, we will be quite busy next month, and it's been a pleasure to hold this space with you. So please keep in touch, and we'd love to know what you have going on for Pride season. We'll keep sharing articles and updates from our side, and we can't wait to reconvene again in these spaces and share awesome and powerful dialogue. So that's us. Wish you a happy end of Mental Health Awareness Month, and happy Pride Month for those who will be joining, who connecting with us on our platforms. Thank you, everyone. Yassine, Sanyukta, Zav, Andre, thank you so much. See you next time.
Thank you.